Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're covering the 2026 book by Jenny Lawson. Now, if you aren't already familiar with her work, Lawson is a San Antonio bookshop owner and the best-selling author behind hits like Furiously Happy and Let's Pretend This Never Happened. She is incredibly well known for writing about heavy stuff, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, but she absolutely refuses to do it with dry clinical language. Instead, she unpacks these massive topics with this wonderfully unfiltered, humor forward, and often self deprecating style. So, today we're going to explore exactly how she approaches mental health by looking at her latest work, How to Be Okay When Nothing Is Okay. It gives us a completely fresh, incredibly visual, and image rich way to navigate those really hard days. Lawson is essentially handing us an absurdist survival kit. It's packed with 5 distinct, highly unconventional tools for those moments when traditional advice just leaves you exhausted. We're going to look at 1. Embracing your inner hippo, 2. Quieting your alarms, 3. Protecting your finite energy, 4. Breaking executive paralysis, and 5. Reclaiming being an amateur. All right, let's open up this kit with part 1, Embracing Your Inner Hippo, which is all about how you visualize your self-image. The visual contrast here is just so striking. Society constantly demands that we have the majesty and grace of a polished lion. You know the exact type, always perfectly put together, roaring with confidence, commanding the whole savannah. But Lawson argues that striving for that perfect image when you're already struggling, it's a total trap. Instead, she says you need to embrace being the hippo. I mean, think about a hippo for a second. It's not glamorous, soft-looking. It spends a massive amount of time literally submerged in mud. But it is also incredibly fierce and absolutely not an animal to be messed with. The big takeaway here is to stop measuring yourself against a polished, magazine cover ideal. Your soft spots and your rough edges aren't liabilities. They're actually just part of your own unique kind of strength. She actually pushes this idea of embracing your rough edges even further with this amazing anecdote about a damaged wall. So instead of covering up an ugly water stain with paint, she transformed it into a whimsical Wonderland rabbit. Just picture that mental shift for a second. She took something broken and stained and visually reframed it. She turned it into art. By treating that damage as a creative feature rather than a bug that needs to be hidden away, she gives us full permission to do the exact same thing with our own minds and bodies. Moving right along to our second tool, quieting the physiological alarms by checking your physical basics. You know, it is just so easy to treat anxiety strictly as a mental problem, but Lawson points out that our physical alarms often sound exactly like our mental ones. Specifically, dehydration is a massive, sneaky culprit. Being dehydrated actually mimics and amplifies anxiety and brain fog. So if you're panicking, well, your brain might literally just be thirsty. The fix here is absurdly simple, but so many of us forget it. You have to establish your physical baseline by watering yourself before you caffeinate. Literally, drink water, then drink your coffee. Fix the physiological alarm first, and you might just find that the mental alarm miraculously turns itself off. Which brings us perfectly to part 3, protecting your finite energy using the spoon theory. If you've spent any time in chronic illness or mental health communities, you probably recognize this visual framework. It's called the spoon theory. It's a highly practical way to manage your day where you imagine waking up every single morning holding a literal handful of spoons. That is your finite energy for the day. Taking a shower? That costs a spoon. Commuting to work? Costs a spoon. Replying to a super stressful email? Boom, another spoon is gone. It's just a fantastic visual way to set limits without the guilt, because you can actually picture your energy depleting. And this is especially crucial for anyone dealing with chronic illness, depression, or anxiety, where your starting handful of spoons might be a whole lot smaller than someone else's. And this brings us to the harsh reality of this framework, hitting 0. What actually happens when you run out of spoons, but your to-do list is still miles long? You might be tempted to just push through, right? But Lawson reminds us that if you hit 0 and make the really dangerous mistake of borrowing against tomorrow's energy, you're going to face a brutal rebound. You're basically taking out a high-interest loan on your own body, and you will wake up the next day in a severe deficit. Mapping your energy this way forces you to respect your limits. It helps you visually realize that saying no isn't a personal failure, it's just basic energy economics. Okay, on to tool number 4, breaking through executive paralysis by lowering the stakes. We've all been there, right? When your brain completely refuses to start a project, answer an email, or even just fold a pile of laundry. So how do you break the freeze? Well, the core shift to unfreezing your brain requires a massive pivot in how we view the task itself. It is all about lowering the stakes so drastically that your brain no longer perceives the task as a threat. You literally have to change the picture of what doing the task looks like in your head. And that perfectly sets up our final tool in the kit. Finally, we have part 5, reclaiming being an amateur to fight back against perfectionism. Think about it. When we are frozen by executive paralysis, it's almost always because we feel this heavy pressure to be good enough before we even start. We are terrified of doing things poorly. But Lawson fights this by stripping the word amateur right down to its roots. It comes from the Latin root amare, which simply means to love. By visually reframing and reclaiming this definition, we see that doing something simply for the love of it, rather than needing to achieve complete mastery or perfection, is the exact cure for the paralysis we just talked about. You are allowed to make art that looks bad. You are allowed to do a hobby poorly. Do it for love, not for a polished, perfect result. And that really brings this whole visual survival kit full circle, standing in stark contrast to clinical books you might see sitting next to it on a shelf. Titles like The Anatomy of Anxiety or How to Be Enough. Lawson's work reminds us of one incredibly powerful truth. We do not need to be fixed, and we certainly do not need to be perfect to be okay. Whether it's literally drawing a rabbit over a water stain or just doing a hobby poorly because you love it, your damage is a feature, it's not a bug. So, I want to leave you to ponder this final question as you take these concepts out into the real world. What if you stopped exhausting your precious spoons trying to be the perfectly polished lion and just loved being the fierce, muddy, completely unapologetic hippo? Hopefully this explainer has given you a new, highly visual lens to look through on your tough days and inspires you to explore the rest of Lawson's incredibly vivid work. Thanks so much for learning with me today.